Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the Kiln Restaking Rendez-Vous. I'm Edgar, protocol specialist at Kiln, and today we have Boba and Richard from Drosera. I'm also joined by a great co-host, Loic, our product manager on Ethereum. And yeah, how are you guys doing today?
Doing great.
Yeah.
Doing
Doing
fantastic.
great. Yeah, thank you for having us.
Perfect.
Be a fun episode.
Yeah, definitely. So Boba, Richard, I'll let you guys introduce yourself, kind of give us your background and how you basically like the story of how you ended up working in crypto and blockchain.
Yeah, I can go. So I'm Boba, CTO at Drosera. My kind of background came from computer engineering. I actually, before I worked in crypto, I really started to even learn about it. I worked at BAE. I worked on basically military weapons GPS, and a lot of that was obviously like closed source technology. Started to learn more about crypto and how it was open source and everybody's like working together on all of this tech. And I got really interested in wanting to be part of that community. Started to learn how to do arbitrage, make arbitrage bots like flash loan bots, and doing kind of monitoring in general for the EVM, and then the Polkadot, and then Cosmos. And so I set up a bunch of these monitoring systems to just detect all sorts of different kinds of events, and then saw there was kind of like a need for seeing exploits occur or seeing like risks or just like other issues in the space occurring. So I kind of got interested in this idea of making this system where we could have nodes protecting your protocol by looking for all these different kinds of events.
Yeah, what's up, guys? I'm Richard. I'm the co-founder and CSO here at Drosera. In terms of like my origin story in the space, first learned about Bitcoin in 2012. Didn't really think much about it. It was $6 per BTC and thought it was a huge ripoff. So kind of wrote it off for a long period of time. I kind of had like a background in more traditional finance. So, couldn't really think about ways of actually valuing this thing based off of any cash flows. So basically just wrote it off for multiple years. Ended up going to a entrepreneur program in Silicon Valley called Draper University, started by a famous venture capitalist called Tim Draper. He's pretty famous for buying Bitcoin from the U.S. Marshal Service that was confiscated from the Silk Road founder, essentially. So he became a big Bitcoin holder and obviously taught the class about Bitcoin. And at that point, I was still not really a believer in Bitcoin, but thought blockchain technology was cool. Met a friend there that was actually building something that was inevitably going to be on Ethereum. This was very early days of Ethereum. I think it was like $8 or $9 per ETH. And he basically said, oh, no, it's a little too expensive. You should wait for it to go down to $6. That was obviously like a bad mistake. I missed that one. But nonetheless, I evangelized Ethereum, thought it was really cool. Like you can actually build stuff on blockchains using Ethereum. So I thought it was really cool. But then joined the industry full time after a backpacking trip in India, actually. Didn't have a career or anything, was just 6 months, like having a great time on the opposite side of the planet. And when I got back to New York, met some people, went to a couple of meetups, got really interested in the technology, and I just decided that this Ethereum thing is really cool and wanted to dedicate my career towards it. So I've been a VC in the space. I was at a group called Advanced Blockchain, which is a German publicly traded venture builder and venture investor, where I led the investments team. I was there for a little over a year and then ended up actually going to Obel Labs. Obel Labs is the leader in distributed validator technology. That's how I really got into the Ethereum proof of stake space. And I really started to get fascinated with the whole node operator business model. So like really, as Boba says, I kind of came and offered the operator availability layer for Drosera because I, built relationships with a lot of node operators while I was at Obel. So yeah, I mean, my experience at Obel translated very well over to Drosera. And I am a little bit of a later joiner to the founding team. As, Boba said before the beginning, it hasn't even been really a year of Drosera. I joined 4 months ago, and it's been quite the wild ride so far. So yeah, that's a bit about myself and how I ended up at Drosera.
you guys have really OG backgrounds in the space. It's very cool to see like MEV, DVT coming from different part of the space, but also and I think this could be a good maybe introduction to talk about Drosera, about security. So like we've seen, I mean, there are a lot of statistics, but I think the most impressive one is in 2022, like more than 80% of DeFi protocols were hacked. So it means that at least in 2022, the space is kind of missing something in security. You mentioned that you have background also outside of crypto. What do you think, like in general, is missing in the Web3 space in terms of security, and how can we just generally improve there before talking about specifically about Drosera and what you bring to the space?
Yeah, Boba, you want to take a stab at it?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that there's a lot missing from security in general in the space, and like obviously everybody has been working pretty diligently to increase our security standards in the space, but I kind of think that is just going to be always the case, because that's how security is. Security is always like a iterative process of like adding more security, especially as new innovations get built. Like we need to continue to add more security, and we need to kind of think about this concept of layered security. And that's something that is existed in the Web 2 realm. Cybersecurity just in general is that there is no one solution that protects you from everything, because that's just not how security works. A layered approach of using multiple different tools and technologies to kind of increase your security barrier is the best way to stay like up to date, because exploits and hackers, they're kind of never ending, and they're always going to find a new strategy, a new meta, and a new way to kind of like break existing systems. And so we have to be really dynamic. We have to be really flexible with being able to like add security on the fly, like add new security practices quickly and elegantly. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do at Drosera, is being able to allow people to like add these security barriers to their protocols on the fly very quickly, without having to do like a 2-month integration process, right? They could do like a 1-day integration process.
Yeah, and I think just to add on to that, right, the question being like, what is missing currently in the Web3 security space? To be honest, it's just missing Web3 security, right? Like the reality is that Web3 security as a concept is like a misnomer. The products that are currently on the market today, again, like they do serve their purpose, as Boba was alluding to, right? Like taking this layered security approach. But the reality is that they're really more B2B companies that are like offering a software package for decentralized protocols to use. So really it's a SaaS B2B play, Web 0.25 if we're being generous, to be completely honest. So I think having a security product that is aligned with the ethos of Ethereum, but also just of the entire industry as a whole, right? Like decentralized security offerings are an absolutely critical layer of the security fabric that will be ultimately, like in combination, the thing that really does keep Web3 safe for all of its users, while also aligning with the ethos of decentralization, which is so critical to the entire industry. So, decentralized security really isn't a thing. There's some quasi examples of decentralized security, but when I say Web 2.5 security for Web3, there's a lot of manual integration work, and these protocols have to actually relinquish some sort of protocol sovereignty, give permissions to a third party in order to actually deliver the promise of security. And we're here to essentially say, hey, there's actually a different way to do it. You don't need to give permissions. We can all remain aligned with the ethos and make a protocol as decentralized as possible for the benefit of its users. So basically, it's security without compromise, right? We don't need to compromise on our morals and ethics and values that we find to be very near and dear to our hearts here as crypto builders.
Great. And just taking a step back, what is the origin story behind Drosera? Like, when did you when did you guys basically meet and decided to work on this problem?
Yeah, I think Drosera has had many origin stories. I think it's evolved over time, and it's taken many different forms, and it's coming to a point where it's really taken all of us, the team, to basically create what it is now. But I think the seed of where it started was basically building out these kind of monolithic monitoring systems in-house, and seeing all of the issues with making those monitoring systems in-house, and the whole process. Building one of those systems in-house is not necessarily the hard part. Managing it is actually the most difficult piece, because now anytime you want to add an update, or the protocol changes, or there's some new feature you want to add, it's a huge process, and you actually have to have developers that are full-time, spending their time managing and developing this monitoring system. And at the end of the day, it is kind of a Web 2.5 solution that you're making, right? You're just creating this centralized monitoring system. I mean, that's made by you, perhaps the protocol developers, but it doesn't really align with the whole point of Web3, which is there's tons of compute out there, and there's all these operators, and we can leverage them and incentivize them to run these monitoring systems for us, so that we don't need to spend time doing that. We can focus on building the protocol. So I think that is kind of where it was born from, and just this idea that we can have decentralized detection and response just by leveraging the systems that are already in this ecosystem. Yeah,
and I think just to add a little bit of color, even though I was a later joiner to the founding team, when I first connected with the CEO, he basically told me about this idea that you can connect node operators with extra compute to provide not just, consensus layer security, which is what node operators typically perform whenever they're running validators for Ethereum consensus, but actually taking that same primitive and bringing it to the application layer and allowing them to make more money by doing more things with their discretionary machine space. I thought that was absolutely brilliant. And that was I was yeah, I mean, I'm still doing things at Obel, but I want to invest in this. It sounds like an amazing idea. After speaking to node operators, I kind of know some of the difficulties around the business model. People can call it, highly commoditized business offering. So if you open up new avenues for them to make additional capital while providing a new type of security, this sounds like a brilliant idea. So that's what initially got me really excited about joining the project.
Very cool. And talking about the kind of decentralized that you mentioned, decentralization of this kind of incident detection stack. What would you say? How do you approach today DeFi protocols, for example? What do you tell them exactly on why these kind of solutions are better for them? Maybe more aligned, but also just in terms of performance reliability. Why is it better for them to use that than their current setup, which, as you mentioned, is pretty Web 2, usually just on-call setup and in-house alerting stack?
Yeah. I mean, there's tons of answers here, but I mean, one of the main ones I think is the fact that we are making Drosera to be this very EVM native platform where you create your security infrastructure with Solidity code. And I think that is kind of a major upgrade, because what this allows for is for developers to actually create this infra inside of the same exact stack that they're building their protocol with, right? They're building their protocol with smart contract code. Why not make your security infrastructure with smart contract code, right? It's all the data already lives, and it is facilitated through Solidity, through smart contract code. All you have to do is be able to grab it and do analysis on it, right? In order to detect certain kinds of events. So making it so that it is a kind of natural experience, making it easy for developers to create infrastructure without having to like set up like a Node.js project and like TypeScript and like all these other dependencies and then host it somewhere. Instead, you just say, hey, make this like, less than 100 line smart contract and then deploy it to the Drosera network. And you've got some type of coverage, whether it's like protecting you against Oracle risk or depegging risk or bridge risk or like all the other exploits that can happen in this space, or just protecting you against, exploits where like, your treasury, if it drops by 50% in a single block, you might want to detect that. You might want to take some type of action. And doing so with like less than 100 lines of Solidity is like a no-brainer. It makes it super easy to test. And that's really what Drosera is allowing. And with a lot of these other security projects, that is the biggest issue. It's like, sure, you can get the security, but like, how do you experiment with it? How do you play with it? How do you see what's possible? And I think right now, that's only really, you can only really see that through like their front ends, right? Where you kind of get like a toggle button or you get like something that was given to you on the front end. Instead, we just say, hey, just use the same language you use to develop your protocol. You know your protocol best, and you can interact with it like directly just with this. So, yeah.
And so you mentioned this test that you wrote in Solidity, and they're called traps, right? Like what exactly do you expect the developer to put in there? Like, is it more like monitoring some invariance of the protocols, monitoring like some metrics over a period of time, and also like what is kind of the reaction that's happening once a trap is triggered? Is it like do you expect like transaction to pause a protocol, transaction to withdraw funds with an admin credentials or things like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that is like the beauty of making it Solidity native, is that like whatever you can really dream up, like whatever you can do with the data that's available on chain, you can use. You can use any of the data on chain naturally just by referencing the contract address and using a protocol's interface to query whatever data you want to query and make whatever inferences you want to make, and you can just do it programmatically. So I think that is like what makes this really powerful, is that we're not saying to people, you have to do it this way, and you have to look for this, and you have to look for that. We just say, hey, we're giving you the toolbox for how you can do monitoring of like any kind, and then all that comes out of that monitoring is whether an incident has been seen or it hasn't. And if it has been seen, you specify an emergency action, which is just like a Solidity or a smart contract function. You just specify that to be triggered by the network of operators if an incident is seen. And yeah, the additional beauty to that is that it can be any function that you want. So it could be a pause function that has an access list so that this trap can only be the one that causes a pause function. It could be a multisig where Drosera acts as like an additional signer to your multisig. It could be transferring funds. It could be like freezing a particular part of your functionality. Like, let's say if you're using multiple bridges and one bridge goes down, you could have a reaction where that part of the functionality is frozen so that your users aren't inadvertently transferring funds into like a black hole. And so, yeah, it's really it gives this like ability back to the developers of like, you have a new ability, you have like a new superpower that is unlocked to you to be able to detect whatever you can think about or whatever is available. So if new protocols get developed and those are put on chain, that's like a new ability for you to use in your trap. It's like there's more data that lives on chain. The more data that lives on chain, the more sophisticated a trap can potentially be. Yeah.
Cool. And like for the traps, do you expect like some like collaboration around them, or is it like more something private developed by each protocol on its own? How do you view the development and maybe contribution and composition of these shops?
Yeah, I expect for this to be like a very collaborative process, mostly in the sense that people can kind of come together and say, look at this library I made that helps for you to grab very specific data from like the top 10 dexes on Ethereum, and it does like a certain analysis for you, or some type of aggregator library that allows you to do some type of aggregated analysis on your trap. So I imagine people can kind of come together and use smart contract code as a way to create more libraries, create more examples of how do you do something. And that should really allow for there to be like a community that can flourish around security, whereas like that really wasn't possible before. As for like, would this be private? Like, would these traps be private? I think ideally you would want your trap to be private, so that like kind of your security conditions are only known to you. But that doesn't mean that you can't still like collaborate with people of like, how do you grab this type of data, and like what's the best way to do this in an efficient manner?
Yeah, very cool. And yeah, definitely interesting, like this kind of application layer, as you mentioned in the ethos and blockchain, where just everyone can compose on top of each other. That's pretty cool. What kind of like, do you think you will target like some specific incidents happening on chain, or like do you really view yourself as kind of an agnostic security layer where just developer can do whatever they want?
Yeah.
You mentioned, for example, on your website, you give the example of Euler. Is there like so that's a good example, of course, but is there also a type of events that could be catched with traps?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's like a whole host of examples that we can show, and we've been kind of working through some of these examples of trying to like create a trap and making it public of like, here's how you could have a trap that protects against like the Prisma exploit that just happened, right? Or a trap that helps against, all sorts of like other issues, like TWAP was one that we recently had a developer work on. So I think that we want to make it so that anybody can kind of create traps for anything. But there are a couple like categories for traps of like, maybe what's the best way to look for an incident related to a lending protocol, like bad debt, right? That might be something that you could have a particular library for, or like a known way for getting this data, or even like bridges. Like, what's the best way to detect if there's something suspicious happening on a bridge, like if its liquidity drops by 50% in a block, right? That might be a very simple example, but it could potentially protect millions of dollars with maybe like 10 lines of code. So I think that we want to keep it kind of agnostic because we don't know what people are going to use traps for, because like every protocol is different, right? And some have some similarities, right? A DEX may care about its treasury. Lending protocols care about bad debt. Insurance protocols might care about other factors, right?
And I'm curious, is there like a risk? Could there be risk that are linked to the type of traps that you set? Like, let's say like there's a like you trigger a trap, and the effect that it has on your protocol is that it freezes some assets, or it completely like locks a position. Maybe we could say that it would trigger like some liquidation event, for example, on that protocol or on another protocol. Do you see like, also, do you think like you have a role as kind of you have a counseling role to make sure that these events do not happen?
Yeah, I think that talking about what actions you can take that will have like a positive impact on the protocol is something that like we want to be a part of those discussions, and like saying, oh, you could do this, but it may have this effect, or you can do this, but it may have this effect. And it's certainly true that taking some action could have like an additional risk. But at the same time, I think it's also just important for us to understand this kind of new concept of what does it mean to have a protocol that kind of has tentacles, right? It reacts to events. It can do things to protect itself. I don't really think that that's like a thing currently, right? Most of the time that a protocol is like taking action, it's like, through like a multisig, and it's kind of like an action that is reacting 2 or 3 hours later after an event has occurred. What we're talking about now is like an action taking place, like potentially a block after an event has occurred, right? And so this may allow for new dynamic ways of handling risks, handling exploits. So perhaps it could make a situation where some asset gets liquidated or some position gets liquidated, but there's nothing stopping you from like having a trap that does more than just freezing something, right? It could freeze something, but then do something else, and then do another action, and then do another action. So it's this idea of really like automating your security, right? And I think that if we can do that, we can start getting away from this idea of like developers waking up at 3 a.m. and like running around with their heads cut off, right? Like we can actually have a solid automation put in place so when developers do wake up at 3 because an exploit happened, they can be like, oh my gosh, we're protected. I'm so glad that we had this thing in place. Now I can figure out why the exploit happened instead of trying to focus on, we need to make sure the exploit can't happen again, right?
Yeah, really cool. And kind of zooming out, so you explained really well like what the Drosera protocol was. Can you tell us a bit like when did you hear about EigenLayer and when you decided that Drosera should be an AVS on top of EigenLayer?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like we were aware of EigenLayer before I think we had really kind of started to create this idea of Drosera. And I think as we learned more and more, because I think all of us in this space have learned more and more about restaking and like what is actually happening in this ecosystem and like what are all the things to think about. I mean, the biggest thing that caught our eye was just this idea of crypto economic security, that you can have slashing, right? That you can have protocol enforcement of the operators running the rules for a protocol. And I think that is kind of what unlocks this idea of like AVSs or just like honestly just networks in general for blockchains, where you can have networks taking some action but being held to some type of standard to make sure that there's like stability and there's health for the protocol that they're protecting or as a dependency for. Yeah, I mean, we just kind of started to learn more about crypto economic security, and we're like, yeah, this is definitely something that is necessary in order for us to like continue to create more sophisticated systems, because like crypto economic security is kind of like a fundamental piece of blockchains in general, whether you look at like Bitcoin, Ethereum, Cosmos, parachains on Polkadot. I mean, everything has some bond requirement where if some malicious action takes place, then people get slashed. And so I think the kind of like realization is that we can kind of start making dApps that do this, or like coprocessors on top of layer 1s and layer 2s that do this as well. And yeah, EigenLayer acts as like a really great marketplace for facilitating that crypto economic security.
Great. And talking about this crypto economic security, one question that we like to ask to every AVS builder is, how much of that economic security do you need or will you need?
Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I mean, happy to take that one. I think the reality is, guys, is that, as AVS is working with EigenLayer, working with these different LRT protocols, that we're actively building out the marketplace in real time, right? Like, I think, people want to try to quantify it, like exactly how much crypto economic security is required, right? So that the cost of corruption makes it cost prohibitive to actually initiate some sort of malicious behavior. I think we're still a little bit nascent with respect to that, set of analysis on like what that cost of corruption looks like versus the expected outcome of that corruption. But I can tell you that we've done a couple of announcements with some LRT protocols, but we've been pretty specific not to like give like very granular figures. And the reason why is just like I think the answer will change over time based off of how much adoption our protocol experiences, right? So in the very earliest days of us being in ABS, there's going to be a different set of considerations with respect to crypto economic security than 6 months later, then a year later, then 5 years later. So I think we obviously, as we strike deals with the different LRT protocols, we want to be kind of flexible with respect to the number just because we don't really know what that figure looks like. And the reality is right now, obviously our priority is shipping and, getting to Mainnet. So I think, I would be kind of fibbing if I told you a very specific number that's required. I guess an easy way would be to say, oh yeah, the more security, the better. But obviously you don't want to be overpaying for like way too much security. So I think the thing that's more interesting for us that we discuss internally is actually the diversification of where we get our security from, where we get our ETH delegation from. We don't think it's smart to only work with one LRT provider because one LRT is not the same as another LRT. So working with quite a few and then thinking about maybe just like being conservative with respect to how much ETH delegation we get could be a better short-term strategy for us. And then of course, as we scale over time, the number I would imagine would grow dramatically. But yeah, that's kind of how like we're thinking about it in this like ever growing marketplace with a lot of unanswered questions. But Bob, I don't know if you want to add any additional thoughts.
Yeah. I would say, I mean, it's kind of like it wouldn't make sense for us to have like a couple billion of crypto economic security and have like a really small protocol that is using us pay for the interest for that, right? It's like they may be a protocol that only has like 2 mil in TVL, right? The amount of crypto economic security they need is, well, it's like 2 mil, right? Or 2.5 or 4 or whatever, right? And so it makes sense to actually kind of like optimize to have crypto economic security placed for particular dependencies. So for Drosera, because it's a security protocol, let's say that, there's like 10 or 20 other protocols that are using us. They all may have different security needs. They may have different levels of TVL that they need like different levels of security for. And it wouldn't make sense for them to all pay some flat fee, that would be like too little for really large protocols and way too much for really little protocols. So I think that we'll kind of see as we start to get more people like using the technology, getting to testnet, mainnet, and seeing like how we can make that efficient and optimized for everyone.
Great. And any views on like attributed security versus pooled security? It seems like right now the meta is really like pooled security, but I feel like some protocol builders might also want to have like at least a percentage of their security being attributed only to them.
Yeah. I think it's it's an interesting discussion. Like, I think it's just kind of like another layer of security, right? Like it makes sense that you would have both. Because like in a scenario where the pooled shared security should theoretically be the most secure layer, right, compared to the attributable security, because like you may have 4 AVSs, right, and they're all sharing the same security, so it may be more difficult for that shared security to be corrupted, right? But in a scenario where maybe 3 of the AVSs are corrupted and that one AVS is honest and isn't corrupted, it may make sense for that one AVS to have attributable security, right? Because now they have like a backup that is protecting them. They still have some amount of security, even though the majority of their shared security has been corrupted, right? And so that's where it makes sense to have some additional layer. So I would imagine that most AVSs will probably go that route where they have like an additional layer of security and not just the shared security. There are some other considerations in there, but I think of it like less of a like a versus and more of just like perhaps how much attributable security they would have compared to their shared security.
Cool. And my follow-up question is around like your roadmap. You talked about being heads down, focused on releasing on mainnet. Do you have a timeline when you expect to be on mainnet?
Yeah, it's like the fundamental question everybody asks is when all this stuff, right? I mean, right now we're really projecting for like an end of Q2 testnet. And I think that given where we are, we're making like really good progress on the client, on the protocol. And I think that timeline still seems like pretty good. We'll probably still have like some additional things that we want to like kind of like clean up by the time we get to testnet. But I think right now it's looking pretty good on that end. Mainnet, I'd say like we're gonna try to shoot for this year. But I think like really kind of taking an iterative process to getting this functionality out, getting operators to experiment with it, getting protocols to experiment with it, and trying to understand like what are maybe some really important features that we need to get some like good feedback from them and understand like how we can really make the system super solid before we get to that mainnet stage.
Very cool. And talking about like, I mean, earlier we talked about the developer and the protocols that may use your protocol to kind of secure and have all these others here on the side. But on the operator side, which is kind of the second type of actors there, what's kind of your view, Richard? You mentioned that you kind of know the space pretty well with your past experiences. How do you, as a protocol, like kind of create a healthy operator set, and what do you expect from operators today when contributing to your protocol?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, my experience at Obel led me to believe, probably naively, that I would just come to Drosera and I'd be able to make a few calls to some friends. I kind of know like who's good, who's not good, who's reputable, who's less reputable, and just like easily onboard everybody. But then I realized that actually the majority of node operators are actually pretty good. Most of them haven't been slashed before. A lot of them are already in the existing EigenLayer set. And then, if we kind of thought to ourselves, we want to bring on 25 node operators to start when we had launched testnet and ultimately mainnet. I think we got to the point very quickly that the 25 spots like filled up, and now we're like 2 or 3x oversubscribed with respect to interest in joining the initial operator set. So we've obviously now had to get a little bit more granular with respect to our analysis of like who we want to work with and why. I think obviously reputation being a critical factor or deterrent for our initial V1, right? Like, we're using kind of like reputation as almost like the bond, so to say, for our early stages of V1. So obviously we want to work with operators that have a lot of reputation at stake so they don't act maliciously. I think that if you go kind of like a step further, I think like a pretty basic answer would be we want to work with like the biggest and the most reputable, but that's actually not the reality. The groups that we want to work with the most are the ones that are more nimble, that probably don't have a lot of VC investment, that are just like that are only very, very granularly focused on the bottom line, and just like it's making all the decisions based off the numbers and the net profit. We want to work with like super nimble, super innovative operators that are like at the bleeding edge. They want to work with a lot of these AVSs. They're probably a part of new proof of stake ecosystems. Obviously never been slashed is like a really critical one for us. And like getting into the EigenLayer set, if not already a part of the EigenLayer set for when we do become an ABS, is another critical factor for us. but we're not necessarily thinking about what their delegation looks like today. We want people that are going to be testing the technology with us, like hand in hand, right? Like for us, the way that we view operators fundamentally are that they are first-class citizens. We want operators to feel like they are empowered to take part in ownership of the network long-term. But with that responsibility also comes, or with that like upside, I would say, comes the responsibility of them working really closely with us on making sure that we can get the best data out there so we can understand how many traps each operator can run. So I think we've started to optimize more for like that nimble, more innovative approach that are operators that are on the forefront, as opposed to the groups that have, raised a ton of venture capital. Now, granted, like obviously there's tons of groups out there that are really good that we absolutely love to work with that have raised capital. Obviously you guys being one of them, right? Like when I say we almost prefer not to work with groups that haven't raised venture capital, that certainly does not like preclude us from wanting to work with those groups, because you guys are obviously very reputable, and the Figments and the Blockdamons of the world, etc., are extremely reputable. So we'd be foolish to not want to work with them, but it's not what we're necessarily optimizing for, right? So in terms of like what there is for upside, obviously for us, we want groups that are nimble and they're going to work closely with us. And in terms of the operators themselves, as I said before, operators are first-class citizens. So we want to make sure that they feel empowered to take ownership of the protocol. And so as a result, we're going to make sure that they're obviously like well suited and well compensated for their time without going into too many details about what ecosystem incentives look like, etc.
Yeah, cool. Having a distributed kind of set of contributors to the protocol itself, pretty cool. And yeah, you just mentioned like incentives, like just high level, like between these like protocols, operators, risk takers, all these actors, like what's kind of the high level overview of how the economics will work there. And yeah, as we mentioned, depending on the economic security you want to have, depending on the number of operators you want to have, this might change, but just a high level overview of this flow.
Yeah, I'm happy to touch on like what our kind of business model is at Drosera and like what that interplay looks like. But maybe more on the crypto economic side, I'll pass it on to Boba here shortly. But in terms of like how stakers, how operators are remunerated in the context of performing services or security services for protocols as an operator within Drosera, the way that they get paid is obviously for every single trap that's deployed on the protocol side. There essentially comes a security budget of sorts, right? And so with respect to the security budget, it's essentially what protocols are willing to pay in any arbitrary period of time. It's a month, it's a quarter, it's maybe half a year, it's a full year. That would be denominated in ETH. So the operators would essentially get paid directly from the protocol for providing the decentralized incident response service. We have built a marketplace. That's basically how we view a decentralized product to thrive and be sustainable over the long term, is to create more of a marketplace model. So the operators have total autonomy to join one security opportunity over another. If one protocol is not going to put up any sort of budget for the security and expect operators to join on board, then they're kind of neglecting basic free market dynamics. So obviously each protocol will be incentivized to put up at least a little bit of a budget to make sure that they're getting a requisite amount of application security. So whether that's a 1 ETH per month or 2 ETH per month, 5 ETH per month, or per quarter, or per year, the free market dynamics will basically create an equilibrium to understand like pricing discovery and pricing mechanisms that are sustainable on the protocol side. And so operators get paid directly from the protocols in that regard, and Drosera gets compensated due to the fact that we would take a small marketplace fee, essentially. And we're still working out what those exact figures look like, but the majority of the assets from the protocols will go to the operators because they're the ones that make the world go round in the context of Drosera, so to say. In terms of like the stakers, I mean, I can tell you, I'm sure you guys have spoken to a lot of ABSs, so you probably have a good idea of like what stakers are compensated in the context of LRT protocols, right? So if I'm a depositor into an LRT protocol, I expect to get compensated by these different ABS tokens in exchange for me depositing my ETH into XYZ LRT protocol. I'm sure it's probably been discussed on previous episodes, but the going rate for those are like generally anywhere between 0.5% APY and 1% APY denominated in the platform token. That's, again, you've probably heard that multiple times already. I think the more interesting part to this discussion, though, is like how does that payment actually take place, right? Like, what are they paid in? And like the answer that I just gave in that example would be like some sort of, AVS token, right? But the reality is that what if this XYZ AVS token ends up mooning, right? Like, are the stakers going to get compensated and like a reduced rate? Is it all going to be compensated or like recalibrated back to ETH, right? Or all of a sudden that 0.5% APY, is that going to jump to 10% APY because the token that they're getting compensated in all of a sudden moons, right? Or conversely, what if that AVS token goes from like $1 to 1 cent? Now you're essentially, as a staker, you're going to pay like 0.005 APY or whatever it is. I'm terrible at head math, but I think you guys get the point. So I think understanding basically like roughly how they actually get compensated, if it is going to be in an AVS token, is what's really important. And I would imagine there'd probably be some dynamic adjustment that would take place if the compensation will be remunerated in an AVS token. I'm not sure if that answers your question comprehensively, but that's kind of where like we spend the most of our time on with respect to like incentives and who gets paid, why they get paid, how much they get paid. Bob, I don't know if you want to add any additional information.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good synopsis of just kind of rewards in general, and how they flow down from protocol to the operators like running these traps. I mean, on the staking side, I mean, the idea is that, the operators are essentially the ones like pulling in the revenue, and then they're the ones delegating it out to the stakers, right? Like based off of how much cryptoeconomic security was delegated to them. And so I think that's like, I think it's like theoretically like straightforward, but I don't think any like practical, any practical implementations are really like put into place for, or like, payment rails are put in place between the stakers and the operators right now. So like really we're kind of focused on just making sure the operators are the ones that are like getting paid, and then for them to kind of facilitate how this payment makes its way to the stakers.
Yep. Just being a quick conscious of time. I know we're a bit over. Do you guys have any hard stops in the next minutes?
I can go on for another 10 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. So my question was just making sure I understand clearly. So like the operators and the risk-takers, they get compensated when traps are triggered.
So essentially, there's essentially a passive rate, and then there's like an active reward. So the passive rate would be for like kind of like participating, right? You're like doing consensus with other node operators of the state of the trap, right? It's like everybody is kind of every block saying, and they're attesting like with the BLS signatures, like this is valid, it's valid, it's valid, it's valid. And, as they're doing this and kind of passive monitoring, they're incurring like a passive rate of this reward that's streaming from the protocols through this trap, and then distributed to the operators who are passively running this system. And then when an incident does occur, then it becomes kind of like a competition where basically the operators are trying to aggregate at a minimum 2/3 signatures to be able to submit those signatures and have the response action get triggered on their behalf, plus the other signers that signed, yes, this incident just occurred. It's the signers plus the person that actually like sent the submission to have this like response action get triggered. They're the ones that are going to get rewarded with the active rewards. So I'd say it's like a two-part system. Yeah, you have your passive element and you have your active element. And the active element has like a bit of a cooperation vibe where you're kind of all working together to attest to this like incident that occurred. And then you're reaping the rewards for actually being the first to have the response action get triggered.
Okay, just finishing off on the incentives part. This is going to be, of course, the size of the incentives are going to be dependent on how many protocols are using Drosera. Do you already have like kind of like protocols like standing by and ready to adopt Drosera when you guys launch on Mainnet? Do you have any updates on the BD side?
Yeah, we have 25, maybe even close to 30 protocols that I've committed to the technology, right? Whether that's in the form of testnet participation, mainnet participation. We have LOIs, MOU signed, with multiple heavy hitter DeFi protocols, some infrastructure companies as well, one or two bridges, a lot of layer twos. Yeah, I mean, really, it's like a pretty large diversity of potential users. But I mean, I would say that like DeFi, liquid restaking, and layer two have definitely been kind of where the majority of our early adoption has been seen. But to answer your question, yeah, we have 25, at least 25 protocols that have committed, which obviously we're really excited because we haven't even testnet yet. So we're doing a pretty good job of like selling the conceptual value proposition of the technology. So yeah, no, we definitely have a nice roster.
That's great. And like zooming out a little bit, like I think it's really great. I think it's great that you're building what you're building because it kind of shows the power of restaking and the power of having a free market for decentralized trust. Because like initially, when people thought about EigenLayer, they thought it would be, oh, it's going to be a great way to do like decentralized sequencing for L2s, like just saying like, oh, let's validate all the chains. You guys, by building Drosera, you proved that it could be those use cases could be a lot more exotic and complex than that. What is your long-term vision for EigenLayer and restaking as a whole? Do you feel like we'll be seeing more and more complex and exotic ADSs?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that we're really just like scratching the surface like right now, just like proving like, hey, we can essentially make like these like co-processors that like feed data out of the blockchain and then right back in, using like ZK technology, just cryptography in general, using a marketplace for crypto economic security. I think that right now we're kind of just like looking at the initial like enzymes. We're like all in the kind of chemistry lab, like kind of experimenting and trying to figure out how we can make this stuff work and how we can actually make like a better DeFi and a better crypto using these like new technologies. And so, I mean, for the future, I imagine that we're going to see kind of like a rapid cooperation, I think, between everybody, because that's like what this is all allowing. It's allowing for everybody to coordinate through cryptography in a way that wasn't really possible before. So I imagine that we're going to see a lot of very new, innovative things. I don't necessarily know what those might be. I think if somebody wants to know, you probably can set up a meeting with me and we can brainstorm and think about it, because I think that there's like a whole host of different applications, dApps, services that probably exist in Web 2 and don't exist yet in Web 3. And I think like with what we're doing, we're just like showing that we can build this base security layer that like allows for essentially validators to not just do consensus layer security, but application layer security. I think that this is just going to allow for us to have Web3 without compromise, right? You don't have to give up on sovereignty, decentralization, or trustlessness, right?
And talking about the future, do you think like we will see more and more alternatives to EigenLayer? I mean, they've been kind of the first mover, kind of the innovator of the space. Do you think like the future is like multi kind of restaking hubs where AVS will kind of have economic security a bit everywhere? Or what's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think, yeah, and like Boba, I'll let you opine on this shortly, but I think we've already started to see some competitors pop up, right? I mean, there's one called Karak. Um, there's at least one more that I know that isn't really public yet, so I'm going to refrain from saying the name. However, I know that it will definitely be competitive of sorts. But the reality is, guys, is that like just like with liquid staking and with staking, the Ethereum ecosystem has its own like natural immune system, right? Where like stake centralization is a very big concern amongst the OGs within the community. And even like the new entrants in the community, right? This isn't just an OG Ethereum problem. This is a problem that affects everyone that touches the ecosystem. Decentralization is the core ethos of Ethereum. Obviously, it's something that we've built our product based off that foundational principle of decentralization. So yeah, I mean, Ethereum won't allow for just one restaking protocol. Business forces might have something else to say about it, right? Like, I mean, Lido is obviously dominating in the liquid staking space, with the Ethereum proof of stake space really as a whole for a long time. And, you know, even in the midst of getting a lot of pressure from the community, they still held a significant market traction or market share for a long period of time. And they still do, right? They're at 29%. It's gone down because liquid restaking is now taking market share away from Lido. I would imagine they probably have something to say about that nonetheless, as like very savvy business people over there. But nonetheless, though, no, I don't believe there's going to be just one restaking protocol. There's already another one out there. I don't know how viable it is. I don't really know much about Karak, to be honest, but there's a couple others that are coming that I think will probably be fighting for market share. I mean, I think like ultimately Ethereum would just never allow for there to be one restaking protocol. So EigenLayer has a first mover advantage. It will absolutely continue to accrue a lot of stake. There's no question about that. But I think that there's a pretty big pie, to take a slice from, so to say, which is the Ethereum ecosystem. So yeah, there's definitely going to be like 3, 4, 5. The amount of adoption, we'll see, but there's certainly going to be more than one.
Yeah. Yep.
Perfect. And you had something to add, Robert?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I just like I think of these things like a lot from just like a fundamental kind of like engineering mindset, which is just that like, there's always just gonna be like more variants of these different types of like systems, and it's just because like, every system takes like different design choices, and different design choices have different pros and different cons, and that's just like the nature of engineering. There's not really like a way to design a system that only has pros, right? That's just not possible. I wish it were, but it's not. So I think that we may see like new platforms like pop up that are designed to have pros that are like very attractive for certain types of ABSs or certain types of services, and not as attractive to others, right? And I think that we'll just kind of see that kind of constant optimization that we see in this space, so that people say like, oh, I want to work with this guy because this actually makes my product like viable, where it may not be viable over here because of X, Y, and Z. So yeah, I imagine that that's what we're going to see in the future, is just like people trying to optimize for use cases. Yeah.
Super interesting. Great conversation, guys. Thank you so much for giving your time. It's great. It's the first time we have 2 guests on. So great to have you. I let you guys just share a bit like your socials, like how listeners can learn more about Drosera, and then we'll wrap this up.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I remember correctly, let me just check here. We are on Twitter, or X as it's called now, at Drosera Network. Would definitely love for you guys to give us a follow. And, we're putting out a lot more content nowadays and have some exciting announcements with some protocols coming up here shortly. So definitely follow us there. We're not really much on like LinkedIn or any of these other platforms. So definitely, I would say Twitter is your place to go. We also, of course, have some dev docs if the developers that are listening here are interested in learning more about a trap, or even like the operators that might be listening in. We have a little blurb about what being an operator in the Drosera context looks like. So I think that's dev.drosera.io. So please feel free to give us a look over there. And yeah, I think that's probably a good summation. Thank you so much for having us, guys.
Pleasure.
Awesome.
Thanks.
All right. Cheers, guys.
Great. Bye, everyone.